Getting started with our conservation webinar today, I'm Casey Shealy, National Technology Specialist for NRCS's West National Technology Support Center in Portland, Oregon. Jeremy Maestas is today's webinar moderator. Jeremy is a sage-grouse ecosystem specialist at the West National Technology Support Center as well. Jeremy, the floor is yours to introduce today's topic and our guest presenters.
Great, thanks Casey, and good morning everyone. Our speaker today is Dr. Joe Smith. Joe received his wildlife biology degrees from the University of Montana and Montana State University, and he's currently a research scientist at the University of Montana based in Missoula, where he's investigating various ecological questions related to conservation of sage-grouse and other sagebrush-associated species on private lands in support of the Natural Resources Conservation Service Sage-Grouse Initiative. Before Joe gets started, I just want to provide a little bit of context on some of his research. NRCS launched the Sage-Grouse Initiative in 2010 to help ranchers proactively address threats to sage-grouse and sagebrush ecosystems through voluntary incentive-based conservation. And we knew when we began that we really needed to integrate science into our delivery so we could better focus our efforts and eventually quantify the outcomes. And so with the help of our science advisor, Dr. Dave Noggle, in support of a lot of folks, including our National Conservation Effects Assessment Project, SEEP, we established some outcome-based evaluations around the range to assess efficacy of our practices and inform adaptive management. And so the work that Joe's going to describe to you will actually be presenting some of that effort rooted in one of the long-term place-based evaluations that we established with partners there in central Montana, specifically to examine the role of improved grazing management as a tool to benefit sage-grouse. Really appreciate all of Joe's hard work over the years helping us to better understand how our practices are affecting the bird and its habitat, and excited for him to share some of that findings with you here today. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Joe.
All right. Thanks for the introduction and the background information, Jeremy, and thanks to you and Casey for setting this webinar up and facilitating all the technology and everything. So I will just jump into this. The bird. So today we're talking about greater sage-grouse, which are the largest and most widespread of the two species of sage-grouse. They're sagebrush obligates that need big, intact sagebrush-dominated landscapes to thrive. It's been estimated that their range has contracted to about half of what it once was. They're a communally breeding species. Most of the information we have about population trends comes from annual counts of birds at their breeding grounds, which are called leks. So range-wide, these counts have declined since surveys began back in the 1950s and 60s. The decline hasn't been steady, but it's characterized by these approximately 10-year cycles. But the peaks and the troughs in these cycles have gradually been getting lower through time. In spite of the losses that have occurred, greater sage-grouse are still widely distributed. Their current range, which is shown here in the light gray, covers about 165 million acres throughout 11 western states and 2 Canadian provinces. And their areas of highest abundance are shown in the darker gray. These are priority areas for conservation. Sagebrush is really the common thread that binds this whole range together, but other than the existence of sagebrush, these ecosystems vary pretty widely from one side of the range to the other. And the threats to conserving sage-grouse and sagebrush landscapes also vary across the range. On the western end of the range in the Great Basin, you have things like conifer encroachment that degrades or eliminates habitat. at mid-elevations, while you have huge wildfires replacing thousands of acres with invasive annual grasses at the lower elevations. In the Rocky Mountain states, energy development has really expanded dramatically in recent decades. For example, the number of producing gas wells in Wyoming tripled between 2000 and 2011. In the northern Great Plains, where most of the research I'm going to be talking about today occurred, cropland conversion really continues to be the major threat to habitat conservation, especially with recent high grain prices pushing conversion into areas where that were historically considered marginal cropland and relatively safe. So in summary, the conservation challenges that remain for this species are many, and there were 8 petitions filed for listing the species under the Endangered Species Act between 1998 and 2010. The most recent decision came in 2015 when they were declared not warranted for listing, mostly because of commitments that state and federal agencies have made to reduce threats to the species. But that decision will be revisited again in 2020, which is coming up pretty quickly. So just before I get into the specific objectives of my research, I want to differentiate historical impacts of grazing on sage-grouse from present-day impacts. I think most of us are probably familiar with the open range period in American history, where in the late 19th and early 20th century, western rangelands were used as basically a completely unregulated commons for several decades before agencies were formed to regulate access to these lands. During that time, western rangelands, including probably the vast majority of sage-grouse habitats, were often overstocked and mismanaged, and that mismanagement degraded the health of those rangelands, probably to the detriment of sage-grouse. It's important to acknowledge that we're still living with some of the legacies of that overgrazing, but it's also important to recognize that that type of pressure on rangelands that happened, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is not really reflective of present-day livestock grazing. Numbers of livestock in the West have steadily declined over the latter half of the past century and continue declining today. According to BLM's data, there's been a 50% reduction in animal unit months on public land in the West since 1941. I mention all this because I'm not going to be talking about these legacy effects of historical overgrazing or about what impact unsustainable high levels of grazing would be on sage-grouse today. I'm also not going to be comparing long-term ungrazed areas to long-term grazed areas. These are interesting questions, but they aren't really the most pressing or relevant questions facing managers today. I am going to try to present information that I think is broadly relevant to managers in today's context who want to understand the effects of relatively well-managed livestock grazing on sage-grouse and want to know how to make changes to lessen those impacts. Understanding the effects of grazing is important because of how ubiquitous this land use is. Even small impacts on a sort of a per acre basis may have very large cumulative consequences when it's scaled up to the entire range. However, almost no research has been done linking grazing to sage-grouse behavior and demography. Most management documents state that improper grazing is a threat, but there's currently a lack of science that would actually help us identify what proper grazing looks like. So there's just a few basic facts about sage-grouse ecology that you need to know for the rest of this presentation to make sense. As I mentioned before, they're a communally breeding species. They breed at leks, and that happens during March, April, and May. From the leks, the females move out into the surrounding area, generally choosing patches of intermediate to high sagebrush cover to locate their nests. So they scratch out a shallow depression beneath the canopy of sagebrush shrubs, and they lay clutches of about 6 to 9 eggs over a period of about as many days. Then they incubate those eggs for 27 or 28 days, and the hen and her brood leave the nest immediately after the eggs hatch. We focused on nesting because this is a major driver of population growth in sage-grouse. A life stage sensitivity analysis that used 50 studies from across the range that came out in 2012 found that nest success, although it ranked intermediate in terms of sensitivity and elasticity, it explained the largest amount of variation in annual population growth because other vital rates tended to be more stable. So this indicates that management actions that increase the average or reduce the variation in nest success have a pretty good chance of boosting population growth. Another reason we focused on nesting is because a number of the hypotheses about how livestock grazing affects sage-grouse have focused on this life stage. So these include direct effects, things like livestock trampling nests or inducing females to abandon and thereby reducing nest success. But the most widely cited hypotheses are indirect. For example, grazing, removal of herbaceous material through grazing reduces hiding cover around nests and therefore increases rates of predation. And this hypothesis has been supported by several studies that have shown links between the height of herbaceous vegetation around the nest and nest survival. Recently, it was shown that the presence of cattle can influence the occurrence of ravens at spatial scales of up to a couple kilometers. And this led the authors of this study to suggest that the presence of cattle, even at broad spatial scales, could increase depredation of sage-grouse nests. And going back decades, rotational grazing systems and resting pastures or deferring grazing until after the nesting season have been suggested as ways that could increase nesting habitat quality. So as Jeremy mentioned in his introduction, NRCS, through the Sage-Grouse Initiative, offered rotational grazing systems as one of the practices that they employed on private lands to try to improve sage-grouse habitat. And they did this primarily through their 528 prescribed grazing practices. And this is effectively a management hypothesis. Nobody had ever tested this, but it logically followed from the previous hypotheses that if those impacts were occurring, if herbaceous vegetation was linked to nest survival, then rotational grazing should provide some benefits. It should increase hiding cover and reduce presence of livestock around nests during the nesting season. So just briefly, our basic hypothesis is that rotational grazing systems and rest from grazing should increase hiding cover and reduce livestock presence, and that these two things in combination should have positive effects on nest survival. So I'll explain this in more detail when I discuss our study setup, but we're expecting that rotationally grazed ranches should have higher nest survival than traditionally grazed, and that rested pastures should have even a bit more of a boost than that. So to test these hypotheses, we studied nesting sage-grouse in a landscape in central Montana. This locator map shows the towns of Billings and Roundup. People are probably familiar with where Billings is. Roundup is about an hour north. And beginning in 2010, NRCS started enrolling landowners in these 528 grazing contracts through the sage-grouse initiative. Now, participation in these contracts is voluntary, but they had pretty good success enrolling local landowners. By the time our study started in 2011, there were 10 ranches enrolled, and of those 10 ranches, 9 of them elected to incorporate rest into their grazing systems. So, and rest is, in these grazing systems, 2 full nesting seasons without livestock grazing. What we ended up with then was a replicated landscape-scale natural experiment where we could test some of these grazing hypotheses, and most importantly, we could ask whether rest rotation grazing provided any benefits to nesting grouse. So what you're looking at here, the gray shaded polygons are pastures in ranches that were enrolled in SGI rotational grazing systems during our study. The darker black dots are the locations of leks, and then the small gray dots are nests. And we had about 500 nests that went into these analyses. I think most of you on this call are NRCS employees, so I won't go too much into the details of how these grazing systems are implemented, because you probably know that better than I do. But if you need that information, the pertinent details are in the methods of the paper that we published last year in Journal of Wildlife Management. So I would refer you to that if you want more details. I want to be sure to acknowledge that this study wouldn't have been possible without our partnership with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Laurel Berkeley and Mark Sapinski did a lot of the heavy lifting to keep this study going, and they continue to do so. The study is ongoing, and it's slated to continue for another 3 years. I also want to acknowledge the staff at the NRCS Roundup field office, who were really key in getting access to the data that we needed to do all these analyses. So this is just a landscape photo from our study area to show you what it looks like out there. The topography is rolling with some steep breaks. Vegetation is a mix of grassland and shrubland. We had both Wyoming big sagebrush and some silver sage. About 30% of the rainfall occurs during June, July, and August in this study area, so it's a little bit different than places like the Great Basin, where it's very dry in the summer. And because the sagebrush is a little more sparse than typical sage-grouse habitat, and the understory is a bigger component of the structure around nests, we expected that this would be one of the easier places to see the effects of changes in grazing management play out. We used pretty standard capture and VHF radio tracking techniques. We monitored nests from a distance so we wouldn't disturb females and cause abandonment. As far as analytical methods go, we used resource selection functions to analyze factors associated with choice of nest sites. And we used binary logistic regression to model daily survival rates of nests as a function of nest and time-specific covariates. The covariates that we explored in these analyses fell into 4 categories. The first, local vegetation. We were looking at both metrics of shrub structure as well as cover and height of herbaceous vegetation, grasses and forbs. For grazing, we kept track of livestock presence or absence at the pasture scale, as well as trying to quantify intensity of use at a local scale around nests. So these are the proportion of plants that are grazed, and then also counts of cow pats both current grazing year and previous grazing years within about a 15-meter radius surrounding nests. Anthropogenic features in this study area consisted mostly of roads and cropland, but there are also some active oil and gas wells on the eastern edge of the study area. So we looked at distance to anthropogenic features as well as cumulative disturbance footprint. And lastly, we looked at several weather variables derived from the DayMet interpolated meteorological products. So we looked at daily minimum and maximum temperature, as well as precipitation, and summaries of those variables over moving windows of up to 5 days. Before I get into the results, just for some context here, this shows the median high male counts at the approximately 30 leks in the study area. During our study, which is that shaded in gray there, so from 2011 to 2015, as well as about 30 years before that. And you can see that we started out at a really low level in the population cycle. And speculating a bit here, but 2007 was a really bad West Nile virus year in Montana, so I think that may have been at least partially responsible for why the populations were so low when the study began. But between 2014 and 2016, average male counts at leks in the study area more than doubled. Here I'm just showing you that hen survival and nest survival were pretty much what you would expect given range-wide averages. So these curves are showing vital rates from the analysis done by Taylor et al. In 2012, and the red dots are showing the estimates from our first 5 years of our study. So nest survival and hen survival were pretty standard relative to range-wide averages. So first we'll look at our management hypothesis, and then we'll get into nest-level covariates. We didn't find any compelling evidence that SGI, rotational grazing systems, or REST increase nest success. The estimated coefficient for rotational grazing systems was positive, but the confidence intervals overlapped 0. The estimated coefficient for the effect of REST was actually negative, which would indicate that nest survival was lower in rested pastures. But again, that confidence interval widely overlapped 0. And again, I just want to point out that nest survival in our study area, overall, the kind of global average is about 41%, so pretty typical for sage-grouse. So beginning in 2012, we extensively sampled vegetation structure on rotationally grazed and traditionally grazed ranches in the study area. Each of these panels is showing the mean and standard deviation of a different metric of vegetation that we studied or measured over 5 years. So the black squares are non-SGI or traditional grazed ranches. The black triangles show those metrics on SGI rotationally grazed land, and then the lighter gray circles are showing those metrics on nearby idled lands that hadn't been grazed for between about 4 and 15 years. And the overall point here is just to show that the effects of grazing systems on vegetation structure were very minor in comparison to spatial and temporal variation in those metrics. So, for example, we found that SGI rotationally grazed ranches were associated with about 0.9 centimeters taller residual grass, but the standard deviation among years was about 3 times that, 2.9 centimeters. So the main point is just that weather and spatial variation were really driving variation in the system. So what sorts of things did influence nesting ecology? In terms of behavior, what led hens to select their nest sites? They selected nest sites in a way that's very consistent with other research. So in the top left panel, we'll start with that. This is showing visual obstruction at nest. There was a slight avoidance of high visual obstruction, which I wouldn't necessarily translate as indicating that they're choosing to be less concealed, but just that they need sort of an entrance or exit route out of the nest shrub. The canopy can't be completely closed. The top right panel shows positive selection for larger nest shrubs. The top right panel shows strong selection for high shrub cover at the patch scale, so they like to be in patches of dense shrub cover. Moving down to the bottom left panel, we found very strong evidence that they were preferring to be farther away from major roads, which we were defining as county roads and highways, not all paved, some of them gravel, but not 2 tracks. So these are bigger roads with more traffic. This next, the bottom center panel is indicating that there was a apparent avoidance of being farther away from 2 tracks, so preference for being closer to 2 tracks, but I don't put a lot of stock in that. I think that what's probably going on there was that we had some sort of biased sampling where technicians tended to be more familiar with the road networks near nests because they kept going back to those again and again, whereas random points were just visited once, and so they didn't have a lot of incentive to find the 2-track that was nearest to that point. And lastly, the bottom right panel here is showing that there's a slight but significant negative association between use and density of previous year's cow pads. So this may indicate that hens are avoiding areas that have evidence of heavy use by livestock in the past. I don't find that particularly alarming for a couple of reasons. The first, as you can see in the histogram behind that curve, which shows the distribution of that variable across all the available sites, 60% of available sites had 0 cow pads, and these heavily used sites were very rare, so preferred conditions probably aren't limiting in this system. And the second issue is that all the cattle use indices that we measured were negatively correlated with shrub cover at available sites, indicating that cattle are already kind of avoiding highly preferred nesting habitat. So these are the factors that affected nest survival. It's important to point out first that there were no herbaceous vegetation metrics that influenced nest survival. In fact, there wasn't really strong evidence for any local vegetation effects on nest survival, and the same goes for grazing variables. However, we did find strong signals indicating that nests farther from major roads fared better, and the strongest effect that we could detect was that of precipitation, and specifically extended periods of heavy rain, so the cumulative amount of rainfall over the past 5 days. So we were lucky in a way to experience some pretty wild weather during the first few years of this study. I'll just walk you through this bottom left figure here. This shows the total precipitation falling between March and August in our study area. Or actually, this is the Central Montana Climate Division, going back to 1948, and I circled the values during the first 2 years of our study. So 2011, the first year, was record-breaking high precipitation, and then 2012, the next year, was record-breaking low precipitation, a really extreme drought. These photos were taken in 2011. The first one, the one on top, is Main Street in Roundup. We had a huge flood that year, so the precipitation was just really phenomenal. So we experienced conditions that really bracketed the realm of possibility in this landscape. And the other thing that I want to point out about this figure is just that variation is really wide. You hardly ever get an average year. The name of the game is really wide swings from low to high precipitation. So that has, as you saw with the vegetation, that has effects, strong effects on vegetation. It also has strong effects on nesting success. So this right-hand figure is showing across the nesting season in 2 different years. So the top year is 2011, the wettest year. The bottom panel, I think, is 2014, a much drier year. So the blue bars in each one of these indicate daily precipitation in centimeters. And those red dots and confidence intervals are estimates of daily nest survival each day. So as you can see, during these periods of really extended periods of heavy rainfall, daily nest survival takes a major dip. And that's really what seemed to be driving a lot of the interannual variation in nest survival in this system. So just to recap, we found, consistent with a lot of other studies, that there were effects of anthropogenic disturbance on nesting females, both in terms of behavior and performance, demographic performance. These extended periods of heavy rainfall were the strongest effect on nest survival, and none of our hypothesized effects of livestock grazing were supported, except that slight evidence for preference for sites that didn't have so much evidence of past years grazing. So while I was analyzing the Roundup nest survival data, we found that one of the central assumptions that underpinned our expectations that rotational grazing would benefit sage-grouse just wasn't quite as rock solid as we had originally thought. This figure comes from Doherty et al. 2014, a paper where they analyzed nest data from 2 study areas in the Powder River Basin in Wyoming and Montana, and they showed that there was a strong relationship between grass height and estimated nest survival. And as I showed you before, this is far from the only study that indicated that same pattern. So when we found this relationship, that it wasn't unexpected, and we didn't really treat it too critically. This is a figure that we put in a progress report from our study back in 2013, and live grass height was the strongest predictor of nest survival, and that's what we thought at the time anyway. So this table comes from a paper published by Dan Gibson and colleagues at University of Nevada, Reno in 2016. And they're listing a number of studies that have tested for effects of either herbaceous vegetation height or cover on nest survival. And as you can see, most of the studies that have tested for those effects have found them. So when we found this positive relationship, that really wasn't surprising. But the problem, which Gibson and colleagues pointed out, was that there was an alternate explanation for that pattern. They just, some more necessary background to understand this. With sage-grouse nesting studies, you can't just kick the hen off of the nest once you find the nest and measure vegetation, because hens have a tendency to abandon if you do that. So what you do instead is you wait until the nesting effort is over, either the hen leaves the nest after successfully hatching a brood, or the nest fails, and then you go back a few days later and measure vegetation. But what this leads to is a systematic bias in timing, whereby successful nests tend to be measured later in the season than failed nests. And this is a problem because this is a period of the year where herbaceous vegetation is growing very rapidly. So grass typically grows about 1/2 inch a week in these systems. And if you're measuring successful nests on average 2 weeks later than failed nests, you'd expect the grass to be about 1 inch taller, even if it had no effect on nest fate. So one way, excuse me, one way to deal with this is to adjust your field sampling protocol so that instead of returning to these failed nests right after you find them failed, you wait until after the expected hatch date, and then you go back and measure vegetation. This should correct for that bias in timing. And what Gibson and colleagues found is that, so they analyzed data from nests in northern Nevada, and they actually conducted their study using the hatch date protocol, so the unbiased method that I just showed you. And what they showed was that if you do it that way, if you collect vegetation in that way, you'll find a null relationship between grass height and nest survival. But then they showed, by simulating measuring vegetation using a fate date protocol, that you end up with a very strong positive relationship between grass height and nest survival. And it turns out that most of those studies that I showed you before that found a positive effect of either grass height or cover on nest fate were conducted using those bias methods. So I'm not necessarily saying that the inference of all of these studies is wrong, but what I am saying is that they all used methods that we now know have an inflated type 1 error rate. So they're very susceptible to false positives. So what we wanted to ask was just how general these results were. We used a fate date protocol, so the bias method, in our Roundup data set, and Gibson et al. Indicated that those two Powder River Basin data sets that I showed you when I introduced this section had also used a fate date protocol. And around the time we started doing this analysis, we were offered another data set that used a fate date protocol from Terry Mesmer and his graduate student, Seth Dettenmeyer, at Utah State University from northern Utah. So we wanted to reanalyze all these data sets and see if we found the same pattern that Gibson and colleagues had found. Just a caveat, this is a convenience sample. We basically reanalyzed some data sets that we had readily at hand. So what we did is, for each study area year, we fit a regression of grass height on day of year, and then we used that regression slope to estimate what the height of grass at each nest would have been if it was sampled using the unbiased hatch date protocol. This is more or less the same thing that Gibson and colleagues did, but just in reverse. So we then use those predicted grass heights to retest for that relationship between grass height and nest fate. So using our original data sets, uncorrected, for all three of these reanalyzed data sets, we found strong positive effects of grass height on nest fate. But when we corrected for phenology, 2 out of the 3, Roundup and the Utah data set, that effect went away. In the Powder River Basin, we actually found out that they had tried to use more of a hatch date protocol when they did their field work, but just due to the logistics of doing field work, they ended up sampling successful nests on average about 4 days later than failed nests. So we still did the correction, and it reduced the magnitude of that effect, but there was still a persistent and significant effect in that data set. So these results kind of got me wondering, why wouldn't grass height be predictive of nest success? How much concealment does grass actually provide in these systems? And measuring concealment from predators directly is probably pretty much impossible because different predators use different modes of searching, and there's infinite factors that are related to some degree to how likely a nest is to be found. But we can at least crudely measure visual concealment nests using what's called the Robel pole. So this is a pretty standard measurement taken in a lot of nesting studies. It's just a 1-inch diameter dowel that's marked at 5-centimeter intervals, and it's placed vertically on the ground and read from a distance of 4 meters with the eye 1 meter above the ground. We do that about 16 times per nest and then take an average to get a relative index of visual concealment at nests. So this histogram on the left is just showing the variation in the Roundup data set in that visual obstruction metric. What I did is I fit nested linear regression models and calculated partial R-squareds to try to determine how much of that variation in visual obstruction was actually explained by 5 different measured attributes of vegetation. So we looked at shrub cover, shrub height, live grass height, herbaceous vegetation cover, and residual grass height. And it turns out that shrub structure explains about 4 to 5 times as much variation in any metric of herbaceous vegetation. So just to recap, flawed field methods, basically just measuring vegetation systematically later at successful nests, has really inflated the importance of grass height as a determinant of nest success in a lot of studies. And in reality, nest success is probably frequently unrelated to grass height, and that makes sense given how little variation in visual concealment is actually explained by grass height and cover. Another point that I want to make is that we need to be really careful about the limitations of observational studies. We can't just infer causal relationships between 2 variables when we find out they're statistically related to each other. So grass height as hiding cover, which was one of the driving motivations for promoting these rotational grazing systems and rest in the first place, has been, I think, overemphasized in the management literature for a long time. And given what I've learned from doing this research and a pretty thorough reread of the literature in light of this information, I think we need to reevaluate how much importance we place on managing herbaceous vegetation to provide hiding cover. So given that resources are always limited and there's a multitude of very complex and huge problems faced by sage-grouse across their range, we need to make sure we're focusing on the known drivers of population persistence. The trick to doing triage is correctly ranking threats in terms of their severity, because not all of these threats are equal. So this is just a conceptual figure here showing a way that you might think about the priority of dealing with various threats, because they vary in terms of their effect on sage-grouse and also their resistance to recovery. So things on the top right of that figure, things like cultivation in our study area and the eastern edge of the range, housing development, energy development. Those are the sorts of things that have very high impacts on sage-grouse at large spatial scales and are very difficult or impossible to recover from once they've happened. I think everything I've shown you today supports the idea that grazing should properly be placed at the lower left-hand portion of this figure, where threats or effects on sage-grouse are probably fairly minor where they do occur, and the effects of grazing are easy to recover from. So obviously there's a lot that we still can learn, or we still need to learn, I think, about the effects of grazing management on grouse, but our findings are broadly consistent with the idea that grazing is a land use that's highly compatible with conserving sage-grouse population. I just want to close with this idea that I don't want to promote the idea or give people the impression that I don't think grazing management is important for the long-term conservation of sagebrush ecosystems. Hiding cover obviously isn't the only function of grasses and forbs. We know from a lot of other studies that perennial herbaceous cover is one of the best predictors of how invasible places are by things like invasive annual grasses. And herbaceous biomass is also related to food availability, things like arthropod abundance and biomass. So what I'm trying to get across is just that the herbaceous component of these ecosystems and grazing are important, but just maybe not so much for the reasons that we've been assuming they are. And with that, I have a lot of people to acknowledge, but I won't. I think I'm running pretty low on time, so I'll kind of skip through this and try to leave a little bit of room to answer questions.
All right, great. Thank you, Joe. This is Jeremy Myastis here again with NRCS. I'll just remind our participants we do have some time for questions. If you just enter your question in the Q&A pod, we'll try to have Joe answer that. Joe, I'll just start here. One of our participants was asking specifically about the weather data that you used and said, were the weather data collected at sample locations or from nearby weather stations? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. We used a remote product called Daymet. It uses weather data from those climate stations, but it actually uses some models to interpolate that onto the entire landscape. So it ends up being a daily gridded data set. So it's at a 1 kilometer resolution. We looked at that. We looked at actually a few sources for that data, but Daymet seemed to fit our needs best. So those precipitation values are taken from basically the nearest grid cell to each nest. So they're at a fairly local scale. It's a lot finer level of detail than just using the nearest weather station.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question from a participant asked, were the visual obstruction measures separated by sagebrush shape, in other words, columnar or spreading? And then a follow-up, is how does the effect of herbaceous cover vary between that sagebrush shape?
I think I don't actually. The first part of the question, no, it wasn't separated by sagebrush type. But in this study area, there really isn't a lot of columnar sagebrush. I've seen that in the Great Basin, but it's really not common in our study area. It's almost all the lower, more spreading type of sagebrush, until you get sometimes down into riparian areas, but it's pretty rare.
Okay, thanks. Moving on to the next question. Someone asked, have you formed any hypotheses about grazing and brood survival or winter survival? In other words, other aspects of sage-grouse life cycle, perhaps other habitat micro metrics that might be important and influenced by grazing?
I haven't exactly. I don't want to speculate on things that I haven't looked at any data on at all, but I will say that the Roundup grazing study, we individually marked chicks, and I think we're up to, probably over 300 individually marked chicks now, and that analysis is to be done. But stay tuned for that. That should be coming out in the next few years.
Great. Another question asks, was precipitation a factor in the outbreak of West Nile virus in the study area in 2007?
Man, I have not actually looked at what the precipitation was like that year, so I unfortunately can't really comment on that.
Did you have documented West Nile in the area?
Yeah, the West Nile, the reason I put that up there is because the CDC data indicates that was a bad year in Montana. So.
Great. Okay, a little bit lengthier question from one of our participants. Did you look at ecological site and or soil type variability across the SGI enrolled ranches versus non-enrolled ranches, and how that may have affected vegetation characteristics? Also, SGI grazing plans may take a while to change vegetation characteristics, and the results might not be seen right away. Would you expect to see a stronger difference among grazing plans through time?
Yeah, that's going to be a limitation of this study. I guess I'll try to address the first part of the question. We didn't try to control for having sort of equal soil types between SGI ranches and non-SGI ranches. We did try to do that with our sampling a little bit. We tried to restrict our samples to the same types of soil on both in both of our treatments, and those were just picked based on the frequency of nests on those soil types. So we were kind of comparing basically the vegetation on the same soil types among treatments. But as far as delays, delayed response, I mean, we did only analyze here about 5 or 6 years into some of these grazing systems, but it didn't really seem like that those differences were getting any bigger through time. And ultimately, I think our results are pretty consistent with research on rotational grazing across all of North America. I think most studies have found that even equal stocking rates, rotational grazing and continuous season-long grazing don't really show any big differences in vegetation. So, yeah, our data set is limited, but I think our findings are pretty consistent with other research on that.
Great, thank you. And kind of combine a couple more questions here. Folks were curious about what did you define as traditional grazing strategies in the area versus the SGI enrolled ranches? What would be a traditional grazing strategy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I probably should have clarified that a little bit. Traditional grazing is really just our sort of bucket term for anything that wasn't SGI grazing, and we did that partially because of data limitations, but also we do know just from working out there for a while that most of the ranchers who weren't participating in SGI rotational grazing were using either season-long grazing or something fairly similar to it, maybe where there's some rotation, but those rotations are in the same order every year, and they're generally slower rotations, so they're spending more time in pastures. So yeah, it's going to be a variety of different grazing systems, but in general, they look more like season-long grazing than the SGI systems.
Okay, great. I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. I want to thank you, Joe, for all of your research and the presentation here today. I'll remind our participants this has been recorded, and we'll make this available through our Sage-Grouse Initiative YouTube channel. You can go to our website, and there's a link there to that. It should be available here in the next couple of days. So with that, thank you, Joe, and I'll turn it back over to you, Casey.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy and Joe, for your time and effort to make the presentation today, and thanks to all participants for joining in. This concludes our webinar presentation.